Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 63. 7 against Konya. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed Kılıç Arslan II's war with Ya Basan, ending with the death of the Sultan of Rum's hated rival in Sivas. But we also saw the Zengid conquest of Egypt and the rise of Saladin, following which Nüreddin Zengi became indisputably the greatest leader in the Muslim world. And today, we will see the limping lion go to war with the light of the faith, a conflict which will ultimately set the Emperor of the Romans and the Roman Sultan down the road that leads to one of the most important battles in the history of Anatolia, and a Turkish victory to rival Manzikert. Myriokephalon. Now to begin, in 1164, Ya Basan lies dead in Sivas, and the Danishmend Beylik stands divided and on the edge of ruin. In Sivas, there is Ismail Bey, the son of Ya Basan. In Elbistan, there is the potentially not even Danishmend Mahmud ibn Mahi. In Kayseri, there is the little attested to Tanu, and in Malatya, there was Nasreddin Mehmet. And of course, there is still our old friend, Melik Zunun. With the inheritance of the House of Danishmend thus divided, naturally, the limping lion was certain to pounce. The first thing that Kılıç Arslan did was actually make peace with his old vassal Melik Zunun, the very man that he had once upon a time driven out of Kayseri. With Ya Basan gone, Melik Zunun appears to have been anxiously looking around for a new patron, and I am sure quite nervously, ultimately signed back up with Kılıç Arslan. Together, they crushed Mahmud ibn Mahi in Elbistan. At the same time, probably in an alliance, Toros the Great rode out of Cilicia and took from the Danishmends those fortresses around Marash that had been seized from the Sultanate when Kılıç Arslan faced war on all sides. Thus, the southern marches of Anatolia, the satrapy first granted to Kılıç Arslan by his father, was now mostly back in the Sultanate. The limping lion followed this up by driving Şahanşah out of Ankara in 1169, in spite of his brother now being a vassal of Byzantium, and thus secured his control over north-central Anatolia. Following this, Kılıç Arslan, of course, betrayed Melik Zunun immediately, for like the third time. And this, as we will come to see, will lead Melik Zunun to of course look for a new patron. The Danishmend Beylik, once the mightiest state in Anatolia, was thus reduced to two squabbling beys. In Sivas, Ismail, the son of Ya Basan, and in Malatya, for now, Nasreddin Mehmet. And neither of them are long for this world. The big picture, overall, is that the fall of Ya Basan and the collapse of the Danishmend Beylik allowed Kılıç Arslan to almost completely consolidate power in Anatolia over the late 1160s. The opposition to his rule was now splintered, consisting of a bunch of smaller beys that he could basically push around and, if necessary, drive out or kill. So these opponents of Kılıç Arslan were looking around for a patron, someone to fund and organize the resistance to Konya. Now, of course, some of these defeated beys appealed to the emperor for aid. But for now, Constantinople, though increasingly worried about the growing power of Kılıç Arslan II, had other irons in other fires. Emperor Manuel Komnenos, never a man who could be called inactive, had been basically throwing imperial power around across the Mediterranean world. He had led campaigns up into the Balkans, had directed an ill-fated invasion of Italy, and had negotiated with the papal authorities to try to bring the churches of Rome and Constantinople back into communion. And as we covered in more detail last time, the emperor had even attempted a quixotic invasion of Egypt in 1169. So now, in the late 1160s, Constantinople just wasn't that focused on Anatolia. And in any event, even the seemingly endless resources of the Queen of Cities were getting a little bit stretched. But there was someone whose resources were not stretched at all. A certain world-conquering light of the faith, the new master of Egypt, and the savior of the lands of Islam from the infidel invaders. And thus, the beys of Anatolia, trying to resist the second sword lion, began turning to Nüreddin Zengi. Now, though his attentions were primarily focused on the Crusaders and on Egypt, as the beys of Anatolia fought amongst themselves, Nüreddin had of course still been getting involved. He campaigned against the Artukids in the late 1160s, for example. But Anatolia was very much a sideshow for Nüreddin. But then, as we discussed last time, Nüreddin finally conquered Egypt in 1169 through 1170. So now, with Egypt in hand, the light of the faith was able to focus on his rival to the north, a rival who by now was clearly on the road towards conquering all of Anatolia. This was terrible news for the limping lion. Nüreddin Zengi now stood as the greatest leader in the Muslim world, both because of the wealth of his Egyptian conquest, but perhaps more importantly, because of the legitimacy and the reputation that conquest gave him. The destruction of the Fatimid Imam caliphs had eluded even the great Tughral, who had dreamed of defeating the Shia heretics and reuniting the Muslim world as the restorer of order and Sunni orthodoxy. And while Saladin had allowed the last Imam caliph to hang on for a short term, the writing was on the wall for the Fatimids. In 1171, with the approval and authorization of Nüreddin Zengi, Saladin officially deposed the last Fatimid Imam caliph. For the first time in centuries, the khutbah was read in the name of the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad throughout all of the mosques of Egypt, along with the name Nüreddin Zengi. Now in Cairo, Saladin was already preparing for another ruler's name to follow that of the Abbasid caliph, and tensions were growing between Saladin and the light of the faith. However, Saladin was still biding his time. He still recognized Nüreddin as his master, and made sure that tribute and tax money made its way to Syria. And thus, Nüreddin remained absolutely triumphant. He had defeated the Crusaders across the Levant and denied their attempt to conquer Egypt. After winning almost every battle that he fought against the infidel invader, Nüreddin had boxed the Latins into a tiny strip of territory hugging the sea. And now he had even one-upped the great Tughral by finishing off the heretics in Cairo. His status as the top Muslim ruler in the world, and indeed his legacy as one of the greatest leaders in Islamic history, was totally secured. But this, naturally, caused increasing tensions between Nüreddin and Kılıç Arslan II. Remember, at the same time that Nüreddin had been defeating the Crusaders in the Levant and conquering Egypt, Kılıç Arslan II had also been having a run of victories, albeit admittedly far, far less impressive victories. Yağ had died, and Kılıç Arslan was well on his way to becoming the master of Turkish Anatolia. Now, while these victories paled when compared to those of Nüreddin, they still greatly improved the standing and the power of the Sultan of Rum. This made Kılıç Arslan more of a threat from Nüreddin's perspective. Thus, in 1171, Nüreddin really began bankrolling the opposition to Kılıç Arslan in Anatolia, basically organizing and funding an alliance of smaller Anatolian beys to oppose the Second Sword Lion. Without imperial aid, these beys were grasping around for support, and Nüreddin Zengi, now the richest, most powerful, and most celebrated Muslim ruler in the world, was of course ready to listen. Now there were 7 key members of this anti-Kılıç Arslan alliance, which is of course where I got the name of the episode. And these 7 were kind of the usual suspects. Obviously, Kılıç Arslan's hated brother Shah was in the gang, having fled to Nüreddin after trying and failing to get imperial aid, at least for now. Then there were the 2 Artukid beys of Mardin and Hasankeyf. There were also the 3 remaining Danishmend beys, Ismail in Sivas, the kind of homeless Melik Zunun, and the new bey of Malatya, a guy named Afridun. See, Nasreddin Mehmet had ultimately been overthrown in a revolt of his military men in 1170 and driven out of the city. He was succeeded by a son, Fahreddin, who lasted for about a year or so before dying from falling off of his horse in an accident, leaving Malatya to his brother, Afridun. Finally, rounding out the 7 was the Armenian lord of Cilicia, Mleh, the brother of the recently departed Toros the Great. None of these rulers separately had the might to oppose the Sultan of Rum, and even together they were only a match for Kılıç Arslan when backed and supported by the light of the faith. But now they were assembled into a great alliance, and soon enough Nüreddin himself sent off his own troops to aid his allies in Anatolia, likely led by his nephew, the Emir of Mosul, playing the role of Adrastus in this medieval Islamic version of the 7 against Thebes. The armies of the alliance were to assemble at Sivas, and from there march on to Konya itself, with the exception of Mleh, who was going to invade Anatolia from Cilicia and thus hopefully catch the Sultan in a pincer. However, hearing of the news of the great armies massing against Konya, in late 1171 Kılıç Arslan moved to Kayseri, which would of course be a front city once the war started. There, the Second Sword Lion did what he had done before. He broke out the quill and parchment and began negotiating. No doubt, he was thinking of the Great War at the start of his reign that had nearly doomed him, and had forced him to crawl to Constantinople as a supplicant. As the snows began to fall, Kılıç Arslan skillfully played his various opponents off each other. And the Sultan, it would turn out, was really able to get the better of his enemies. For one thing, Kılıç Arslan was just very good at negotiating from a position of weakness. And then, as the negotiations went on, Sivas became increasingly uncomfortable for the anti-Konya alliance. As winter set in, the vast armies began consuming all of the food in Sivas, which, remember, is in a very cold and not particularly fertile part of Anatolia. This caused the people of Sivas to begin to grumble against the armies, and the armies to begin to turn on each other. Kılıç Arslan skillfully exploited this situation. Now, he did make some concessions, particularly to break certain members of the coalition away. He agreed to set free certain prisoners who he held who were family members of the Danishmend Bey of Malatya, Afridun, and he did so without ransom. Then he agreed to give his brother Shahanshah a pension. But the Sultan still had his limits. He flat out refused to cede any territory to his enemies. Furthermore, when Shahanshah requested that his children be released, the Sultan not only refused, but reportedly even had one of them burned alive as a warning. Just a wonderful way to treat a nephew, of course. Ultimately, as winter dragged on and famine set in Sivas, the enemy army was undone. Tired of the coalition armies devouring their provisions in a hard winter, and perhaps provoked by agents of the Sultan in Konya, the people of Sivas themselves rose up in rebellion. In the words of Bar Hebreus, the nobles begged Ismail, the son of Danishmend, the governor of Cappadocia, to give corn to them and to their dependents, so that they might live thereon until the summer, and not die, for they had a large number of granaries which were loaded full of wheat. And when he refused and would not give it to them, they gathered together and killed both him and his wife, who was the sister of Kılıç Arslan, the Sultan, and 500 people of his household, and his slaves and his women, and they took possession of his barns and storehouses. The revolutionary mob thus sacked the palace and ripped apart Ismail Bey, his wife, and their entire household. And though Ismail's wife was Kılıç Arslan's sister or half-sister, I doubt that Kılıç Arslan was overly sentimental about her end. This effectively ended the first campaign of the Seven against Konya, and the armies dispersed. Kılıç Arslan had survived through his skill as a negotiator and with the luck of the weather, and had only been forced into making minimal concessions. But note that I called this the first campaign. Indeed, the second campaign began basically immediately. In early 1172, that is just a couple of months after the overthrow of Ismail Bey in Sivas, Melik Zunun made his way to the court of Nüreddin, now in Damascus. Ibn al-Athir writes, Nüreddin received him with honor and kindness, and provided for him all that was fit for princes, and promised him aid and efforts to restore his kingdom to him. Happy to try again to defeat his rival in Anatolia, Nüreddin thus quickly outfitted Melik Zunun with a small Zengid army and sent him north. Melik Zunun and his small army made their way north to Sivas, where Melik Zunun appears to have quickly established himself in his cousin Ismail's place. Once in Sivas, he immediately began to negotiate a deal to take over Amasya, where Yağub Arslan's widow had recently seized power. To secure her claim to what was traditionally the other great Danishmend capital, she offered herself in marriage to the newly arrived Melik Zunun. However, while negotiations were ongoing, the people of Amasya rose up and overthrew her, and apparently just chopped her up into pieces. Aren't the Middle Ages just delightful? Melik Zunun was thus stymied from taking Amasya, but was nevertheless now in control of the great Danishmend city of Sivas. Kılıç Arslan, no doubt, wanted to ride back to Sivas to put a stop to this Danishmend revival under Melik Zunun, a man who, if you will recall, he has double-crossed like 3 or 4 times so far. But the limping lion had a far bigger threat to face down. See, as Melik Zunun rode north through the passes and into Anatolia, Nüreddin Zengi had written to Kılıç Arslan, demanding that he restore Danishmend rule in the old Danishmend heartlands around Sivas, Amasya, and throughout the center and east of Anatolia. Kılıç Arslan, of course, refused, and instead assembled the armies of the Sultanate. And so, in Syria, Nüreddin Zengi pulled together a great army, and in 1173 finally invaded Anatolia himself. And as fate would have it, this will turn out to be the last campaign of the great conqueror's life. The Zengid army, under the light of the faith, moved swiftly into the southern marches of Anatolia, the mountains where, many years earlier, Kılıç Arslan himself had first been set up by Mesud. Kaysun, Marzaban, and even the great city of Maraş fell with shocking speed. In the space of just a few weeks, basically all of the southern conquest of Kılıç Arslan's father, the great Mesud, had been reversed. Nüreddin then broke off a small contingent to further fortify Melikzunun in Sivas, and he sent letters off to the rest of the anti-Kılıç Arslan alliance, calling them back to the field. Nüreddin then crossed the Taurus Mountains and came onto the Anatolian plateau itself, the first and only time that the great conqueror of the Middle East would enter this land. As his armies advanced north out of the mountains and into the central lands of the Sultanate, the armies of the Sultan of Rum rode out to meet them. Somewhere on the river Ceyhan, north of Maraş, likely not far from the city of Elbistan, where the limping lion had first ruled his marcher lord satrapy, the two armies met. Michael the Syrian tells us that the two armies met on opposite sides of the river, and that both armies were so massive that both Nüreddin and Kılıç Arslan were wary of fighting. See, river crossings are very difficult things to pull off, particularly in the Middle Ages when facing Turkish horse archers. The army crossing the river would get bogged down, making them easy prey for their opponents on the opposite banks. Thus both leaders prevaricated, likely each sending small parties and sorties to various crossings. However, this then meant that these large armies were basically locked in place on the river, leading to them eating through their supplies. Michael the Syrian tells us, "Then famine beset both armies, and many died from it." Perhaps a small engagement was fought at some point, however, the end result is clear. The limping lion blinked first and abandoned the campaign, returning back to Kayseri and leaving Nüreddin in control of the field. Though this was militarily basically a draw, it was a strategic and political defeat for Kılıç Arslan. Nüreddin had invaded his territory to prop up a rival in Sivas, a member of the hated House of Danishmend, the traditional rivals to the Seljuks of Rum, and the second sword lion, the man who claimed to be the master of Anatolia, had then failed at driving him from the plateau. And then a serious political defeat followed upon this strategic defeat, because word soon came to Konya that Nüreddin Zengi had managed to convince the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to formally invest him, the light of the faith, with all of Kılıç Arslan's territory. This was a serious blow to the limping lion's legitimacy. Remember, the Seljuk dynasty had long positioned itself as the defender of Sunni orthodoxy. Recognition by the Caliph was critical to laundering steppe power, to the Seljuks presenting themselves to their subjects as proper Islamic rulers, not rampaging Turkish savages. Now that said, however, this does not mean that Kılıç Arslan was going to just hand over his sultanate. Indeed, no one really expected him to do that. His position among his beys and his troops was still strong. The legitimacy of the rule of the House of Seljuk, particularly in Anatolia, did not rest solely on Abbasid recognition. Thus, having been basically defeated on the battlefield, with Sivas in Danishmend hands yet again, with the alliance against him mobilizing, and with the horrible news from the Caliph in Baghdad ringing in his ears, the limping lion set out to do what he always did. Indeed, what he was honestly pretty good at: negotiate from a position of weakness. See, the limping lion was a pretty shrewd operator, and he seems to have always had a very clear idea not only of his own weaknesses and strengths, but those of his adversaries. And he quickly realized that while Nüreddin had gotten the better of him at the standoff on the river Ceyhan, and while he had failed to drive Nüreddin out of Anatolia, the reality was that Nüreddin actually did not want to stay in Anatolia for an extended period of time. Yeah, he was happy, more than happy, delighted in fact, to back a coalition of rival beys to oppose the Sultan of Rum. But his appetite for actually marching onto the plateau was limited. He needed to return to Syria to oppose the Crusaders, to keep his control over the beys and emirs of the Levant and Iraq, and to keep an eye on the increasingly independent Saladin in Egypt. The Light of the Faith did not have the appetite for a long and brutal campaign on the Anatolian plateau. And thus, though he was in a weak position, the deal that Kılıç Arslan managed to negotiate was all in all not that harsh. The Sultan would remain in power in Konya, of course, and the Sultanate would retain basically all of its territories. Kılıç Arslan would recognize the independence of Melik Zunun and his rump Danishmend Beylik in Sivas, with Nüreddin Zengi as its nominal overlord. Based on later events, we can also say that it was now, at the very latest, that Şahanşah returned to Ankara. But aside from that, the Sultan would remain the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. The Light of the Faith would pack up and return to Syria. But there was one clear implication of this treaty of 1173. The ability of Kılıç Arslan to make war in the east was effectively ended. Sivas, Malatya, the southern marches of Anatolia bordering Syria, all of these were now under the control of the rival Anatolian alliance backed by Nüreddin. And for as long as the Light of the Faith lived, Kılıç Arslan would not campaign against his vassals and allies in Anatolia. The east and the south of Anatolia was, for now, pretty securely in the hands of the Sultan's enemies. And this inability of the limping lion to campaign in the east meant that, of course, he was going to campaign in the west. That is, against the Roman Empire. And thus, the limping lion began to set out down the road that leads to Myriokephalon. Now it is worth diving into the reasons for this. Why did Kılıç Arslan have to campaign at all? Why did he have to go to war in the first place? This is sort of something that's constantly bubbling under the surface. Sultans and kings and emperors in this time are sort of constantly at war, and it's worth asking why. Why not just sit in Konya and chill? Well, for one thing, all of the states in this part of the world at this time were effectively agricultural and animal husbandry societies. This was not yet an era of great technological advancement. So there were no industrial societies that could get richer through improving their technological capacity and efficiency in the use of resources. And aside from a handful of maritime trading republics in Italy, there weren't really any mercantile societies either. That is, societies that could get richer primarily through increasing and improving trade with other societies. So if you wanted to be richer than you are now, well, then you need more land to farm or pasture your animals, along with more peasants to work the land and herds to graze on the land. So all large states, whether Turkish, Crusader, Greek, Armenian, or whatever, were fundamentally involved in war for sort of the same reason that basically every large company today has an active mergers and acquisitions program. This was how you made your state wealthier. And this was especially true for Turkish states, like the Anatolian Beyliks and the Sultanate of Rum. Remember the ever-present dual role of a Seljuk Sultan, to act as both a steppe warlord and a Muslim ruler. The tribes, of course, demanded pasturage and plunder. Now, the tribes would, of course, just kind of go off and raid the settled world regardless, But the Sultan still saw leading them in war as important. Though his control over the tribes would never be absolute, this was where part of his limited control over them came from. And furthermore, even the emerging settled Turkish warrior caste demanded the proceeds of conquest. These warriors were not nomadic tribesmen, but they still wanted the gold, slaves, tax estates, and lands that conquest brought, especially as many of these settled Turkish warriors would still own vast herds of animals. And a sultan who did not deliver the proceeds of conquest could easily end up the way that failed steppe rulers tended to end up: dead. They were heavily incentivized to provide the proceeds of conquest to their followers. Therefore, these states were, in some ways, predatory by nature. They were like sharks, animals that have to keep moving to stay alive. They had to conquer. They had to fight. Furthermore, remember that jihad, the war for the faith, was a crucial part of the Sultanate's legitimation. This had really come to the fore in the aftermath of the Crusader invasion, when the Sultan of Rum had cemented his control over the Turks of Anatolia by picking up the mantle of the jihad, by being the man organizing and leading the war of resistance. And as the Sultanate became more cooked, it became more Perso-Islamic. As with the great Seljuk Empire in the days of Tuhrul and Alparslan and Melik Shah, the state used religion to basically launder steppe power, to transform barbarian steppe horse archers into proper Islamic rulers. This was a critical part of the way that the regime legitimized itself in the eyes of the Muslim nobility and the increasingly powerful and important administrative class. War with the Roman Empire, always the great enemy of the Islamic world, going all the way back to the days of the messenger, was part of being the leader of the jihad, and thus presenting oneself as a proper Islamic ruler. And this was particularly important to the limping lion at this very moment. Nüreddin going to the Abbasid Caliph and getting him to proclaim that the light of the faith was in fact the rightful ruler of Anatolia was incredibly dangerous from Kılıç Arslan's perspective. Remember that Nüreddin, or rather Sherko and Saladin under Nüreddin's orders, had just conquered Egypt and overthrown the Shia Fatimid Imam caliphs. He had accomplished a feat that had eluded even the great Tuhrul, and had ridded the world of the great rivals to the Abbasid dynasty. Surely there were those in the Muslim world, perhaps even in the palaces of Konya, who saw in the light of the faith the redeemer of the lands of Islam. Now, to be clear, there was no way that Nüreddin could really conquer Konya, and there was no way that a letter by the caliph was going to, in itself, unseat the limping lion. He did not depend on the recognition by the Abbasid caliphs to that extent. Indeed, as we will discuss in more detail in a later non-narrative episode, the influence of the caliph was weaker here in the frontier world of Anatolia. The overwhelmingly Christian subjects of the Sultanate really didn't care that much about what some caliph in Baghdad said. Indeed, recognition by the emperor of the Romans in Constantinople was probably more important on that front. Anatolia was a frontier world of shifting and overlapping religious identities and practices, a world of wandering Sufi mystics, Christian monks and holy men, Greek and Armenian converts to Islam, and largely illiterate Turkish tribesmen, and even some Turkish Christians. In such a world, the word of the caliph mattered less than it did in the great and civilized cities of Iran and Iraq and Syria and Egypt that had long formed the heart of the Muslim world. But nevertheless, this news was still a blow. There still were civil and religious officials of the Sultanate who would have been aghast at this withdrawal of caliphal recognition. And in such a religious time, it was also just sort of bad vibes for a sultan to have the caliph opposed to him. The limping lion still felt the need to do something here, something to shore up his religious credentials and his standing with the caliph. These factors therefore all came together and, of course, resulted in the resumption of war with the Roman Empire. And in some ways, this was really just an escalation of conflict. See, despite the agreement struck between the emperor and the sultan in 1163, the raiding of the empire by the tribes had not ceased. Remember, Kılıç Arslan had promised to discipline the tribes and stop them from raiding the empire. But of course, this was a promise he was not capable of fulfilling. The Byzantine records, naturally, reference continued Turkish incursions. John Kinemos, for example, references attacks on Laodicea and Pentapolis, though he also says that Süleyman Bey, the commander of the Western theater in the war between the empire and the Sultanate, was in charge of Western Anatolia and offered compensation. But after 1173, the limping lion looked set to resume large-scale raiding of Western Anatolia. Indeed, Niketas Choniates and John Kinemos both reference a larger invasion of the West in this year. This increase in raiding, now likely ordered and directed by the Sultan himself, was accompanied by the news of the deal signed between Kılıç Arslan and Nüreddin. And news of this treaty, naturally, caused great consternation and fear in Constantinople. From the Byzantine perspective, it appeared that Kılıç Arslan had signed an agreement to attack the Roman Empire in alliance with the greatest Muslim conqueror in the world, the great Nüreddin Zengi, who you must recall had just conquered Egypt in part through defeating a Byzantine army. The Light of the Faith was the top military power in the region, arguably in the whole world at this point, and one whose status as a great Muslim conqueror, the leader of the Great Jihad, had just been incomparably enhanced. To Manuel Komnenos, this all looked like a huge Muslim alliance to renew the jihad, but now against the Roman Empire instead of against the Crusaders. This perception was reinforced when Emperor Manuel wrote to Kılıç Arslan asking him why he had broken the treaty and was again leading raids into Western Anatolia, and the Sultan answered by hemming and hawing and talking about his problems with the caliph. As John Kinemos writes, writing to the Sultan of Iconium, he, that is Manuel, reproached him for his faithlessness and inquired the cause for which he had so suddenly waged war on the Romans. The other alleged many and various excuses, and said that their caliph, the high priest among them, was angry at him for having agreed to such an extent on friendship with the Romans. So saying, he sent the envoys back empty-handed. This naturally led Manuel Komnenos to view this whole thing as a grand Ghazi alliance against him, a great jihad. Now afraid of something bigger than just Turkish raiding, even large-scale Turkish raiding, Manuel assembled an army in early 1174 and marched it down to Alaşehir, then called Philadelphia. This appears to have deterred an invasion that Kılıç Arslan was planning, but the situation in Anatolia remained extremely tense. Both sides started gathering up their armies for a great struggle. But then something happened that threw all of Anatolia, and indeed all of the Middle East, into political chaos. An event that overturned the geopolitical table. On May 15th, 1174, Nüreddin Zengi, the Light of the Faith, died in Damascus at the age of 56 from complications resulting from an abscess in his mouth after suffering from a fever for several days. the greatest Muslim conqueror to live between the days of Tughral and Saladin, the man who had dealt Outremer a grievous blow and had overthrown the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, was now dead. And I think we should mark this by noting that Nureddin's role in history is all too often poorly remembered today. In the popular imagination, the light of the faith is overshadowed by the coming conquests of the great Saladin, whose own chivalry and personal honor, as well as good fortune, earned him a sterling reputation from his crusader foes. This ensured that it was Saladin who would come to be celebrated in both East and West for centuries, while the man who laid the groundwork for those conquests, the man who in fact launched Saladin's career, is often overlooked. Nüreddin Zengi, the light of the faith, consolidated power in Syria and the Levant, thus arresting the fall into chaos caused by the Seljuk collapse. His conquest of Egypt and the toppling of the Fatimid Caliphate marks a true victory for Sunnism, as it was Nüreddin, and of course his generals Sherko and Saladin, who put an end to the world's first Shia caliphate. And in a brilliant military career of almost unvarnished victories, it was Nüreddin who reduced Outremer to an untenable strip of land hugging the Middle Sea. In short, he was one of the greatest Muslim heroes of the Crusades, and I hope that I have given him his due. In Egypt, Saladin wasted no time in proclaiming himself a sultan, marking the formal beginning of the storied Ayyubid Sultanate. However, to be clear, this was merely a formal declaration of something that was, in many ways, already an accomplished fact on the ground. Saladin's armies would soon be invading Arabia, the Levant, and Syria, with the great conqueror himself entering Damascus. From here, the road for the new sultan will lead, of course, to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the death of Nüreddin Zengi led to the collapse of the alliance opposing the limping lion. Without the support and the cash provided by the light of the faith, there was just no way for the disparate collection of smaller beys in Anatolia to stick together and oppose the Sultan of Rum. Within months of Nüreddin's death in May 1174, the limping lion made quick work of them. Indeed, his conquest of his rivals in Anatolia was so swift that no battle is even recorded. It seems that with the light of the faith gone, there was simply no one with the military force or the wealth or the legitimacy to withstand the Roman Sultan, and they knew it. Instead of putting up a futile resistance as the armies of the limping lion rode out of Konya, the various beys still opposed to the Sultan, seeing the writing on the wall, simply fled their cities and fortresses. Melik Zunun and Shahanshah fled to Constantinople, seeking refuge with the emperor of the Romans. Another minor Danishmend Bey fled to Mosul. Over the course of just a couple months in 1174, Kılıç Arslan had finally reconquered Anatolia, and had done so basically bloodlessly. And in doing so, the second sword lion finally accomplished a task that had eluded all of his forebearers. The House of Danishmend, the great rivals to the Seljuks of Rum, was utterly defeated and driven from power for good. As Michael the Syrian tells us, now it happened that when Kılıç Arslan heard about Nüreddin's death, he came to Sebastia and took it along with Komana and Neo-Caesarea and exterminated the remaining line of Danishmend. Thus was the rule of the House of Danishmend ended. And I think I would be remiss to not stop for a second and reflect on the final fall of the House of Danishmend. The rival house for mastery of Anatolia that has been with us for like 25 episodes. The Danishmend Beylik represents a great what-if in Turkish history. If a couple of things had gone a bit differently, it could very easily have been a Danishmend kingdom that ruled Anatolia until the coming of the Mongols. The great Emir Ghazi had of course been recognized by the great Seljuk Sultan Sanjar and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as the king of the north. And under Emir Ghazi and King Muhammad, the Danishmends were basically the lords of Anatolia. Furthermore, Ya Abasan had a real shot at defeating Kılıç Arslan II. Just a couple things break a different way, and the future of Anatolia looks totally different. Maybe Emir Ghazi doesn't die in Kastamonu. Maybe King Muhammad crushes Mesud, or Mesud loses to the Crusaders. Maybe Ya Abasan destroys Kılıç Arslan II in an alliance with Nüreddin in Constantinople. Any of those things were possible, at times perhaps even likely. But in addition to being a great what-if, we should also recognize the importance of the Danishmends on their own terms. Despite being largely overlooked today, the dynasty was one of the most important beyliks in Anatolia, effectively leading to the initial Turkification of central and northern Anatolia. As we will cover in a later non-narrative episode, there was a significant Danishmend contribution to the architecture of the region, and even some literary and historical contributions made in Sivas and Amasya. And most importantly, in my opinion, it was in a sense the Danishmend Beylik that saved the Sultanate of Rum and indeed Turkish Anatolia itself from destruction. When the first Crusaders invaded, Gümüştegin Gazi could have easily allied with the Crusaders in Constantinople to destroy the first Sword Lion. But he didn't. Instead, in an act of true leadership, he immediately recognized the threat posed by the foreign invaders and was the first major bey to join Kılıç Arslan's alliance. That is, Gümüştegin laid aside his rivalry with Konya, ceased the war that he had been waging with the Sultan, and immediately rode to his aid. How many leaders in history can we say would have done such a thing? But now it is finally time for us to bid farewell to the House of Danishmend. As 1174 came to a close, the Beylik had entirely dissolved, gone forever, conquered by the second Sword Lion. But this new Anatolia, created by the death of Nüreddin Zengi and the conquests of Kılıç Arslan, was of course now on the edge of war. Kılıç Arslan now stood completely triumphant, the unquestioned master of Turkish Anatolia. And the view from Constantinople began to grow progressively darker. After reinforcing Alaşehir, that is ancient Philadelphia, the emperor returned to the Queen of Cities sometime in late 1174 or early 1175, after hearing of the death of Nüreddin Zengi. He was soon back in Constantinople, receiving Turkish political refugees, fleeing the second Sword Lion's conquest of Anatolia. The Danishmend Bey Melik Zunun and the Sultan's own brother Shahan Shah showed up in his court in Constantinople, informing the emperor of Kılıç Arslan's seizure of their homes in Anatolia and pleading for aid. All of this raised serious alarm bells on the Bosphorus. The Sultan of Rum, who the emperor had last seen as a supplicant in Constantinople, was now the master of Turkish Anatolia. Indeed, with the fall of the House of Danishmend, the great rivals to the House of Seljuk, he was more powerful than any Roman sultan had been since the days of his namesake, the first Sword Lion, before the coming of the Crusaders. And not only was the limping lion stronger than ever, but he was clearly no longer on the friendliest of terms with the Roman Empire. The Sultan had entered into a treaty with the emperor as a supplicant and had promised all sorts of things. Now, some of these he had fulfilled, at least for a time. Over the preceding decade, Kılıç Arslan had in fact done a pretty decent job at disciplining the tribes for their raiding, though of course not a perfect job. But honestly, given what everyone knew about the nature of his control over the wild tribes, he had done as good a job at constraining them as the emperor could expect. The Sultan had also sent off the contingents of troops that the emperor had requested. Troops who had largely seen service in the Balkans. Konya had of course been handsomely compensated for this, but yet again, the Sultan here held up his side of the bargain. But there were two areas where the Sultan had emphatically not lived up to the terms of the peace signed in Constantinople. He had not abided by his hollow promise to not make deals with foreign powers without imperial consent, though honestly, there was no way he was ever going to comply with that. But now, in the eyes of the emperor, an even greater breach had occurred. In Constantinople, the Sultan had agreed to turn over to Byzantium certain cities that he conquered, including Sivas, which had just fallen to him. And yet clearly, the limping lion had no intention of ever doing that. To the imperial authorities, this was a grievous breach of faith. Indeed, John Kinemos calls this out explicitly as a reason for the coming war, writing, "Neither did he, that is Kılıç Arslan, render to the emperor any of the cities of which he had become possessed, nor did he desire to fulfill any of the other things to which he had previously agreed." Furthermore, as we just discussed, Kılıç Arslan had then made a deal with Nüreddin Zengi, in which he had agreed to attack the Roman Empire. This had even been followed by an uptick in Turkish raiding, and Kılıç Arslan ceasing to abide by his promise to discipline and constrain the tribes. All of this looked to Manuel Komnenos suspiciously like the beginning of a great jihad against the empire, led by the two greatest Muslim rulers in the region, Kılıç Arslan II and Nüreddin Zengi. Then Nüreddin Zengi died, of course, and it was here that we see Manuel make the first of his blunders. It appears that the emperor fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between Kılıç Arslan and Nüreddin Zengi. He saw the death of the light of the faith as a blow suffered by the limping lion, the death of a great ally of the Sultan in this coming great jihad. He did not see it for what it actually was to Kılıç Arslan, namely a great boon and a massive relief that his great enemy had kicked the bucket. Nüreddin had not really been Kılıç Arslan's ally at all. He had been his opponent, a man who had funded the alliance against him, who had beaten him, and then imposed a peace settlement on him. Manuel believed that the death of Nüreddin made Kılıç Arslan weaker, when in fact it had made the limping lion incomparably stronger. Indeed, zooming out a bit here, the fundamental geopolitical reality was that Kılıç Arslan had agreed to a deal with Byzantium when he had been extremely weak about a decade ago. This deal was full of concessions made by the limping lion. However, in the intervening decade, and in particular over the last couple years, Kılıç Arslan had grown incomparably stronger. The deal that had been reached earlier in his days of weakness now made no sense at all, and both sides could see that. Facing this reality, the emperor decided that he had to do something to confront the Sultan. And when analyzing the emperor's coming actions, we need to look at both the person of Manuel Komnenos and the situation of his empire. Manuel Komnenos was an aggressive and audacious commander and ruler. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that his audacity could border on delusion. His dreams for the empire, the dream of restoring it to its prior glory, combined with his preference for lightning campaigns and willingness to take huge risks, made him a truly hyperactive and audacious emperor. A couple episodes ago, I said that what stood out to me about the late Sultan Masood is that he was a survivor, not a dreamer, a cautious and careful ruler. Manuel Komnenos was sort of the opposite. He was a dreamer and a gambler, and his career was full of these sorts of incidents. As we covered, in the beginning of his career, he led an army to Konya itself in a bid to topple the Sultanate of Rum. And then later, he sent off a Roman fleet and expeditionary force with the absolutely insane goal of trying to conquer Egypt. But there were other incidents as well that we haven't covered. In 1155, he had launched an invasion of Italy. Like the invasion of Egypt, a quixotic and honestly sort of delusional attempt to restore Roman power and influence in a place where the empire's writ had not run for centuries. Now, sometimes these gambles did pay off. His war against Antioch that we covered in a prior episode is easily the best example. He succeeded in something that even the great Alexios had failed at. Similarly, he conducted several audacious wars in the Balkans and Hungary that were largely successful. Furthermore, I think we can even see his initial campaign against Konya as something of a qualified success, even if he obviously failed at the likely impossible task of taking the capital of the Sultanate. And though this is speculative on my part, I think that there were enough of these successes that Manuel became convinced of his own brilliance and of his sort of audacious strategies. Like a gambler who hits it big on a couple big payouts, he could overlook his losses elsewhere and think only about his wins. At least that's my personal take. And now, in 1175, the emperor was of course thinking about his old dream. The dream that he had started his reign with decades earlier. To finally defeat the Turks and, God willing, drive them out of Anatolia. Capture Konya, destroy the Sultanate of Rum, and reincorporate Anatolia, the former heartland of the empire. In short, to reverse the verdict of Manzikert. And from his perspective, this was actually the perfect time to do it. As I said earlier, the emperor had severely misunderstood the consequences of the death of Nüreddin Zengi. He believed that the limping lion had lost a great ally, not that he had been rid of his greatest rival. Furthermore, in 1175, the Roman Empire itself seemed to be in a solid position to wage a war in western Anatolia. Indeed, the best shape that it had been in since Manzikert. During the 10 years of peace, or maybe quasi-peace, since the submission of the Sultan in Constantinople, the emperor had strengthened the Roman position in western Anatolia substantially. The fortresses and cities of the interior of western Anatolia, including Bergama, then Pergamum, Kırkağaç, and Edremit, were reinforced, both through building works and through stationing larger garrisons. Byzantine tax records also show an increase in the taxes remitted to Constantinople from western Anatolia in this period, indicating a strengthening of imperial control over the region. Western Anatolia was now a far better base from which to attack the Sultanate. If the empire was going to go to war with the Sultanate of Rum, if the dreams of driving the Turks from Anatolia were to be realized, then, as the emperor saw it, this was the best time to do it. And so it was that, fatefully, Emperor Manuel Komnenos set out to reverse the verdict of Manzikert. So next time, we will see the Emperor of the Romans assembling great armies to confront the Roman Sultan. And we will see the limping lion, the master of Turkish Anatolia, prepare to resist. And thus, the armies of Constantinople and Konya will come to clash in one of the most important battles to ever take place on the blood-soaked soil of Anatolia. Mirio Kephalon.